Welcome to Indie Thoughts, the segment where we talk to independent game studios and get a little more insight into their creative process. Today, from Giant Sparrow, we have Ian Dallas on.
I'd like to start off with a little bit about your professional background because you have a fascinating professional trajectory. I saw that you started doing some writing for The Onion, and in some of the other interviews I've read, you were really interested in doing writing but for video games.
Yeah. My initial expectation in college was that I would start writing for TV and movies, which in 2000 was a little bit more of a kind of established career trajectory for a writer. And then I figured I would eventually move into writing for video games. And I kind of realized about 10 years later that job, did not exist in the way that I was hoping it would. That I think writers in video games is maybe a little bit better now, but it's still pretty bad. In terms of your role on a team is pretty much to come in and put lipstick on the pig. That so many things have already been decided by the time the writer is involved that you can't really change the course of things very much. So I decided to go back to school and a lot of sort of self-training in programming and other things to start making my own prototypes and eventually games.
So you mentioned going back to school. Before you did that, I saw you were a tester. Is that correct?
Yeah. When I worked in television, one of the quirks of TV is that the shows, even when they're successful, are on hiatus for a lot of the year. And so you'll find yourself on a show, like often shows get canceled, but even when they're not canceled, you'll have a couple months where you are technically unemployed. And in order to keep your unemployment checks, you need to apply for jobs. And so I was up on Craigslist, like just applying for random jobs that I thought sounded kind of interesting, hoping I wouldn't actually get any of them. But then I got a call back at this place testing video games. And so I was kind of reluctantly went and got a job offer. And spent a few months testing games. And that was my first job in the industry. It was really helpful to see the other side of things. You're in development on a game, it can be kind of puzzling to wonder, like, how did this tester, find this bug that would have required you to spend like 2 hours hopping in one place, in one part of the level that no one would ever go. And it's like, that's the job to find those things. Yeah.
And it did seem to influence some of your work, but we'll get on to that in a bit.
Sure.
What I was going to go to after this point was, after you finished up the What Remains of Edith Finch, it seems like you did a lot of traveling afterwards. From what I could gather, about 7 countries in 6 months?
Yeah, more than 7. I think probably like a dozen or 2. Ooh. And then once I got back, I have gone out 2 or 3 times, 3 times since then. So another dozen countries.
And I also saw that late last year you climbed Mount Rainier.
Rainier.
Yeah. So how was that experience? That was a harrowing read.
Yes. I was just talking about that today, actually. That was one of the most intense and traumatic experiences of my life. And I'm really glad I did it, but hope I never live through something like that again. It's been interesting to have something that was so positive in retrospect but harrowing at the time. Trying to imagine, because that's kind of the experience that I would like to create for players in games that we make, things that stick in people's memory. And I think in order to do that, there needs to be an element of trauma, like just the way that the brain works and the things that we choose to record into memory. There's some amount of fracture and like really taking you out of your comfort zone that is, if not necessary, then certainly very helpful. Thinking about that, both in terms of like experiences I want to have in real life, and then also how do we do that for people in games within their living room is it.
Well, a couple things you said just there about using the trauma to try to engage with people. We'll definitely touch on that in a moment. But One of the things when I was doing my research is you had talked about how your experience as a tester influenced the Unfinished Swan, because when I was looking into it, I was curious what the inspiration was, and I found that you found that storybooks were a big inspiration for it. I know that this was your first outing as a studio officially. So what was motivating you? It seemed from what I could gather, you were really wanting to build a really unique world you wanted to explore in unique ways. So I'm curious your exact perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it from a development standpoint in terms of like what motivates me
Hmm.
is a sense of discovery. Like I
Right.
really, and it's something that I'm more conscious of now as I get older. I don't know that when I made the game, I was quite as aware of that, but like what interests me in life is, the pursuit of knowledge and new experiences.
Hmm.
And so, making a video game for the first time was definitely a new experience for me with a lot of painful and insightful moments, along that path. And
Hmm.
it works out very nicely that the games that I have made also, kind of are about that experience. So the quest for understanding and at the same time the acceptance that, you will never really understand things
Hmm.
is part of the process of making a game, and then also the experience that we are trying to evoke in the games that we have made thus far.
Hmm. And one of the things I thought was really curious because the thing that I saw leading up to the Unfinished Swan being released is everybody focused on the first level. They all talked about the paint. So when the reviews came out and I saw that there was more to the game than just painting the world, that was interesting to me. Was that something that you expected in a lot of the lead up, or I saw that you were really fascinated by the range of scores you guys were receiving?
Yeah, I think with the questionable benefit of hindsight, I feel like it was a mistake for us to uh, not communicate clearly to people what the game was.
Mm,
So we were making a game about the unknown, and we
right.
wanted to surprise people. So there was an argument that we made to ourselves that the best way to do that would be to give people no frame of reference for
Mm,
what they were about to experience. And in some ways, like it was a little bit of a mislead if all they knew about the game was that it was in a white landscape and you were throwing these black paintballs, when in
right.
fact the game itself like kind of morphs every 10, 15 minutes into something completely different. And we thought that that would be the way to guarantee a surprise. And I think it did, but not necessarily a pleasant surprise for all
Hmm.
players. And I think what we found is that because we didn't give people enough of a sense of what to expect, they built up a vision of the game in their own mind, which
Hmm.
much more like Portal, in that they were expecting that it would be one core mechanic and that you would, kind of be challenged on your understanding of that core mechanic in a series of increasingly, kind of devious puzzles. And
Hmm.
I think there's a version of the game that, could have been that. It's just not the one that we wanted to make. And
Right.
so, I think we had a lot of people who were upset about the game, because it wasn't the one that they were expecting. And we could have done a better job of communicating what to expect without ruining all the surprises. I think it would have been challenging, but it was something that we tried to be more conscious of on Edith Finch. And especially
Hmm.
now that we live in a world where a lot of people are going to watch gameplay videos on YouTube of the game
Right.
before they even experience it. So I think there's really like at least two different kinds of players out there. There's the people that are going to ruin everything for themselves already up front and just like obsessively read about the game, and there'll be no surprises really for them, but they're fine with that. And
Right.
then there's a much broader group of people that aren't really paying attention to that anyway.
Hmm.
And they just kind of like listen for the games that their friends are talking about and that are kind of out there in the ether. And so we worried a lot about ruining the game for both people when like I think one group of people, they're going to ruin it for themselves no matter what anyway. And the other group, like you can't ruin it for them. So on Edith Finch, we just, kind of tried to reveal as much as we could, more than we were even felt comfortable with, just on the
Hmm.
thought that like, it's probably not going to make that big of a difference anyway, and it's better to not have people be disappointed, because if people really don't want to know anything about the game, they can adjust for themselves, how much
Right.
about it ahead of time. So we don't have
Hmm.
to be that gatekeeper. We're on Unfinished Swan. I think we really wanted to make it a surprise for everyone.
Well, and speaking of surprises, as the game development went on, it seemed like you were really expanding on the emotional scale of what you wanted to attack with the Unfinished Swan. What was that process like for you? Because I saw you wished you could have play tested it a bit more. I remember I read that when you had some younger children play it at PAX, I think, they didn't really have the idea that you guys were going for. What did you think about as you were developing it, the kind of story that you wanted to tell? And this will definitely tie into What Remains of Edith Finch for particularly spoilery reasons. So,
I think it was somewhat similar in both games in that we did not start off with a story,
hmm.
or if we did, it was a story that was eventually completely abandoned. We started off more with feelings of
Hmm.
what was this kind of experience that we wanted. That in the case of The Unfinished Swan was like the experience of reading a children's book. Kind of what
Hmm.
is that in totality feel like, down to the fact that it is very small and that you can tell how far you are in the book and how close you are to the end of the story, and the kind of lightness and tone of that. So we, because started off in that direction, and then as we built it out, it became more wistful than
Hmm.
we kind of expected. And there's a sterile quality to austere white landscapes
Hmm.
that I think we felt was already there in the game and that worked best with the mechanics that we were developing. And so we kind of wrote a story that fit with that world. We kind of built it from the moment to moment gameplay and then the landscape first, and then kind of like, what is this story feel like, because the story ultimately is the easiest thing to change in game development. All of the lower pieces are much harder, and so we kind of dialed those into a place that felt good to us and then worked backwards.
Okay. Well, and I'll take this opportunity. You've provided me a great pivot right here. You talked about building it as a children's storybook. So, moving on to What Remains of Edith Finch, you wanted to do a hard 180, is what I would imagine. Because for the sake of honesty, I played this game. I picked it up on PS4 shortly after release. And don't get me wrong, I beat it in one sitting, but when it was done, I just laid down in my room and turned the light off. And I'm like, I'm going to question my mortality now.
Oh,
So.
beautiful. It sounds like you had a very, what I would consider positive experience.
There we go.
Yeah, connected. Um, yeah, it didn't feel like a 180 to me so much, although I understand where if you were like, say making a bookstore and these were books, you might put them on very different shelves,
Yes.
uh, for very different audiences.
Hmm.
Um, they came out of, I mean, I think they both are very indebted to books.
Hmm.
So Unfinished Swan is children's books and Edith Finch is weird fiction. It's
Yeah,
this
right.
genre of the supernatural tales that kind of predates what we think of as horror, when literature was still, wrestling with the unknown.
Hmm.
And yeah, that kind of sense of the literary unknown mixed with the sublime aesthetic experiences that I've had in my own life of, like,
Hmm.
scuba diving and being in cathedrals, and that sort of being very small in a place that is beautiful but also overwhelming. And so that was kind of the goal with Edith Finch. And yeah, I mean, they're not identical, but they are, both, I think coming from literary inspirations. And yeah, there's a lot of common themes that weirdly like work themselves out in the stuff that I've done, that it's really like mean for that to be as prominent a part, but it just over time, they become kind of weirdly similar.
Now, the it was pitched originally. I'm not sure if pitched is the right word, but you talked about how it was essentially approximately 13 different prototypes that you figured out how to tie into one game. Which of those prototypes really resonated the most with people? Because I have a specific one, but I'm curious what one you hear about the most.
Well, the one that I hear about the most now is definitely Lewis's story. And at the time, like when the game came out, it was a little bit more of a toss-up between Lewis and Gregory's story.
Hmm.
But now it's like almost all Lewis, and I think like Lewis is definitely the most extravagant of the stories, and it's also the one that is the most directly uh, the most like touchstones with people who play video games, right? Like Lewis
Hmm.
is a pro who, is kind of lost inside of a video game essentially in his
Hmm.
life, and I think that is feels very true to the people who play games. So it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's got a good lesson in the way to I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit of an easy slam dunk there. It's like we've moved the basket, down 2 feet, um, making a story about people who play video games. It's like it made it easier on ourselves. But that's the one that I hear the most conversation about.
Well, and I would agree with that because there was an interesting juxtaposition there. Just so I make 100% clear, Lewis is the one in the fish factory, right? I
Yes,
just want
it's
to.
the canner.
Great, awesome. So as I was playing this section, it was a fantastic juxtaposition of this bright, like cheerful area. But from the very beginning, you're given the fact that you're having something chop the heads off the fish.
Yeah,
So from the beginning, it's a Chekhov's gun from the get-go, and it's building toward this happy, momentous situation. But us as the observer, we know that this is a very troubled individual about to engage in a very troubled situation. So I know I was playing through it with a friend, and when that was done, we had to pause the game for a minute. It's like, whew, I don't know that we can keep doing this one. We might need to take a break.
yeah. Oh, it's
So
good to
you
hear.
nailed it.
Thank you. Yeah,
Uh,
it was very surprising to see how the game felt when it was put together. I think we spent a lot of time working on the individual stories in isolation because each one of them, had their own set of problems. But once we got it kind of on its feet and people could play, 6 stories in a row, we
hmm,
were really surprised to find out how much dread people came into later stories with because
yeah,
they had gotten into this rhythm with each of the stories, realizing that, oh yeah, this person's going to die and that person's going to die. And so it
yeah,
allowed us to have a very light touch, especially with the later stories where, and I think stories are more powerful and that the kind of dread is coming from the players themselves, and
I
that
would
we
agree.
don't have to do any of that work at all. We're in a kind of enviable place with the later stories, like with Gregory and Lewis.
Hmm. Now, was Gregory the toddler in the bathtub?
Yes.
Okay, that was going to be my follow-up. Was when I started up that particular story, I'd already figured out what the beats were in this game. So I didn't want to do anything. I just wanted to watch the toys, and I
Mhm.
spent maybe 10 minutes on a scene that should have taken 90 seconds because I didn't want, like, it resonated in a very visceral way. And afterwards, I saw this game's been nominated for a BAFTA. Like, yeah, all right. Yeah, I could see
Yeah, Gregory's story was a very interesting challenge, trying to keep it respectful. I think one of the
that.
things that we discovered fairly early on was that we got very different reactions from players who were parents versus
Hmm.
players who did not have children. The ones with children, it seemed much more uh, a danger that they had thought about and kind of worried with their own children. So to see it acted out was more intense for them, and we made sure to play test it with parents throughout development. And actually, the night of the BAFTAs, someone after we won the award, I had 3 people, 3 fathers, come up to me and one of them had just had a baby, their first like a couple weeks ago, and the other 2 I think were a little more seasoned hands. But 2 of the 3 uh, said that they thought that it was an amazing portrayal of that fear, and they thought that it was really sensitively well done, and
Hmm.
just were over the top. And the other one thought it was like a cheap sentimental trick and was really incensed about it. And I think 2 out of 3 is not bad.
There you go. That's what Meatloaf
Yeah,
says, right?
you're never gonna make all the people happy, I think, with something unless it's like so watered down that it makes nobody really happy.
Right.
But that was a story that was tricky, but luckily because it comes late in the game, I think we were able to kind of present it, mostly just by context.
Hmm.
That like I think what we found in Gregory's story worked the best is to actually swim against the current on that one, where we have this very heavy topic, and like the scene itself is so brightly lit, and you're playing with these colorful toys, and there's the most ridiculously upbeat music, and all of these things are just like working against the darkness in the player's own heart. That
Hmm.
we don't have to bring any of that. We can just be kind of creating a context for the player, to kind of experience these things for themselves.
Makes sense. Now, one last question I have about this game is you seem to intentionally, well, first, quick side note, did you intend to tie it into the Unfinished Swan when you created it, or was that something that happened organically? Because I thought that was the one bright spot in that entire game.
Yeah, it was something that was an idea I think that we came up with early on
Hmm.
that initially seemed a little bit like a joke. Like I think it was around the same time that we came up with Finch Pets as a DLC spinoff. Um, that we joked about, and then at some point it was like, I don't know, should we do it? Would that be a fun thing? And yeah, like with the crossover between the Unfinished Swan and Edith Finch, I think it was the realization and the increasing truth of it that these games really did share a common creative link, that it actually made sense for there to be a kind of continuity between them, because
Hmm.
as different as those worlds are, they're still exploring what you could describe as like the perils of the imagination as a
Right.
subtext, for that all these stories kind of revolve around that concern. So yeah, it was something that started off as kind of a joke, and then when we sat with it long enough, we're like, oh, actually, that probably, yeah, would make sense.
That does thematically tie in. Yeah, it worked. So the last real question I had was you intentionally pull away from the grandma story, Edie Finch's story, in the middle of it. Do you guys actually have the plan of what her story would have been? And I'm not asking for the story. I'm just curious how intentional, what the different theories you've heard about what the story would be, because you obviously want us to fill in the gaps in some way.
Yeah, I would say that there is no canonical ending to that
Okay.
story that we wrote and then we're like, yeah, we're gonna save this and people will never figure it out. I think I always thought of it as being written, like the whole game is really being written from Edith's perspective,
Hmm.
and like, she doesn't know all of the things that happened and she's making guesses about it. And so like I never imagined, an omniscient perspective. And I think, there were a number of different ideas that were tossed around at various points about, how this thing might have gone, but nothing that we landed on as like, yeah, yeah, no, this is the thing we're not going to tell people. Um, there was also like a number of completely different ending stories that had nothing to do with Edie and Edith's mom's conflict. That yeah, are just completely different endings that I spent a good year and a half trying to figure out before abandoning, and then realizing the way that it felt like it kind of had to end. So it was something that we weren't like spending 5 years of development with this story in mind that we were converging towards. It was
Hmm.
much less planned and much more organic in its development.
Well, that actually provides me with another solid segue. You recently talked about your next gaming endeavor is going to be focused on animal locomotion.
Yeah,
Am I getting that correct? So
that is correct.
I'm curious. I'm not going to pump you for details because I'm sure I'm one of a billion who does that. But I am curious as to are you trying to focus on the way that these different animals move, or are you trying to communicate how that gives them their individuality? I'm curious with animal locomotion. That's very broad, and if you're not comfortable sharing, I won't ask.
No, I mean, I think there's really not much to tell at this point. Not just because, we're keeping it secret, but because I genuinely don't know. These games start off with, like a very slender but compelling idea that I want to explore, and then they, kind of spiral out from that. So for this next game, like I've just taken a year off essentially
Hmm.
and gone back to school to study animation.
Hmm.
So I am learning to, animate and to develop a better eye for how creatures move. And the next game is, essentially the experience that I have when I watch a crow landing on a branch
Hmm.
and feeling that connection with another living thing that is, in some ways remarkably similar, um, and then also, like wildly unknown and different, in other ways. And so I don't know what the game is ultimately going to become, but that's what I'm interested in exploring, is that kind of the beauty that surrounds us that we are often unaware of.
Hmm. It's curious because prior to recording this, I had speculated. First off, I am curious what the scope of the game will be, only because your previous endeavors have gone with the 4 hours or less approximately, and it's a good amount of time to tell a solid, strong story. You get it punchy and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Um, and I had speculated with somebody else that this upcoming idea, it would seem very on brand if it tied into the different ways that you interact as an animal in the forest, and it would allow you to draw a connection between how these animals are moving, in addition to, say, the rise and fall of this ecosystem and everything that's in it. But that's pure speculation because it said locomotion, and I'm thinking, what could they do with that? So um, I'm I and everybody else am incredibly curious where you'll go with it. But I know you only talked about it. Was it this most recent GDC?
Yeah, it was the most recent GDC.
Okay, just
And a
wanted to
lot of
make.
that is because, like, genuinely am still trying to figure it out. I just know
Hmm.
that when I see a crow landing on a branch, like I just find that so compelling,
Hmm.
and I take that moment and, create an interactive experience that helps players to see this thing that is all around them and is like, yeah, I mean, it's very magical.
Hmm. Well, that right there, that's a solid pitch in and of itself. I'm sure you've already got people hounding you about it there. But on that note, is there anything else that you would like to share about the future or what you've seen that you've really been impressed by from both the media and your fans? Is there any general thoughts?
I mean, I guess I'm just really thankful that so many people have played our most recent game, Edith Finch, with their guard down, and
Yeah.
that they have allowed themselves to be emotionally vulnerable. That there are not a lot of games that reward that, and so I would have, like, I really was not expecting to hear so many people, come away with, kind of traumatic but ultimately powerful and helpful experiences from the game. And it's been really encouraging, to hear stories from so many people, that they've had, such moving experiences. And I think a lot of that is really to their credit as much as, to the teams in making this thing. That I mean, it's such a collaborative process on the part of, the storyteller and the audience, to be vulnerable. That yeah, I'm really surprised and thankful and encouraged, for the next project, to make something, that is a little bit unusual and potentially meaty, but that tries very hard to reward that kind of patience and attentiveness and vulnerability.
It sounds absolutely fascinating, and I couldn't be looking forward to it more, even with just what you've given. So, on that note, Ian, thank you tremendously for coming on.
My pleasure. It's always so much fun to talk to someone who has done their homework and who has taken
Well, thank you.
time to come up with interesting and unusual questions. So it makes it much more interesting conversation, hopefully for both of us.
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Joshua.
No, thank you very much, Ian. You have a good evening.
You too.
Thanks
for scheduling. All right, bye.
Bye.
What did you think of The Unfinished Swan? Did you enjoy What Remains of Edith Finch? Did it strike an emotional chord with you? Let us know. But until next time, this has been Indie Thoughts with Ian Dallas.